The liberation of our people begins with the emancipation of our minds. Welcome to Unenslaved. All journeys to freedom begin with the emancipation of the mind because an enslaved mind can neither commit itself to the fight for freedom nor imagine itself as free. We liberate our minds when we unlearn, reconceptualize, and redefine what the world has conditioned us to believe and accept about ourselves, our oppressors, and our society. And we heal our minds by working through, reprocessing, and letting go of the mental, spiritual, and physical trauma that is the legacy of the oppressed. Our journey to mental liberation begins with the 5 steps of Omonira. As a reminder, the 5 steps of Omonira are: Step 1, identify the oppressor's binary system. Step 2, identify the oppressor's adoption of their binary part. Step 3, identify how white racist psychopathy enables the oppression of our people. Step 4, identify the oppressor's psychopathic projections and the targets or objects of such projections. And Step 5, identify and heal the traumatic wounds of our oppression. In this episode, we will explore Step 2, identifying the oppressor's adoption of the binary part. This will require us to answer the question, how is whiteness central to white racist identity? Let us begin. All oppressors claim the alleged superior part within the binary system they fabricate, and by extension, all the attributes that supposedly make such parts superior. This identification becomes central to the oppressor's self-identity. Oppressors delude both themselves and the world at large by asserting that their superior binary part incorporates all desirable characteristics, and that such superior part is the polar opposite of the alleged inferior part of the oppressed, which incorporates all undesirable characteristics. These oppressive binary systems reflect all or nothing thinking in the most extreme and destructive form. The maintenance of the rigid separation between the superior and the inferior is required for the survival of these systems because they do not tolerate gray areas or in-between spaces. Indeed, oppressors are obsessed with preserving the division between the parts because their delusional reality of superiority is entirely dependent upon such division. In other words, the superiority of the oppressor is predicated upon the declared inferiority of the oppressed, because one part cannot exist in the absence of the other part. Consequently, oppressors become trapped within and enslaved by the very systems they create to subjugate and exploit the oppressed. So, how does this play out in the real world? Our primary oppressors identify themselves as white. White people are individuals who believe that they are members of a white race. They believe that there are fixed, permanent, or unchangeable cultural, genetic, or physiological differences among ethnic groups that are delineated by skin color, hue, shade, hair type or texture, or virtually any other phenotypic characteristic. More specifically, white people are individuals who, 1, believe that race is a biological reality instead of a social construct created to perpetuate white supremacy, and 2, have consciously or unconsciously adopted whiteness as a part of their identity. What is whiteness? According to James H. Cone, the famous African-American theologian, whiteness characterizes the activity of deranged individuals intrigued by their own image of themselves and thus unable to see that they are what is wrong with the world. For the unenslaved, whiteness is every quality, characteristic, and attribute that those who believe they are white have adopted or identified as belonging to white people. Intercontinental European imperialism in the 15th century spawned the social construct of whiteness. When the Europeans began their genocidal conquest of intercontinental colonialism and colonization in the 15th century, they also began ascribing certain phenotypic characteristics, for example, white skin, straight hair, thin lips, and aquiline noses, exclusively to themselves in order to construct a fabricated racial hierarchy among the world's various ethnic groups. While the classification of whiteness began with the Europeans' racialized adoption of skin color and hair type, the foundation and root of whiteness itself stemmed from a pre-existing and well-established European psychology and culture. The distinctly prevalent and particular European imperialist predisposition to oppress fellow human beings was first primarily expressed or realized internally, that is, within the European continent itself, before it progressed and spread, beginning in the 15th century, as white imperialism across Africa, Asia, North and South America, and Australia. In other words, Europeans first practiced and perfected their unique and particular brand of savagery upon themselves, that is, their fellow Europeans, for thousands of years prior to transporting it to the rest of the world, which resulted in, to name but 2 examples of their atrocities, the transatlantic slave trade and the genocide of the indigenous peoples of what is now called North and South America. European imperialists, enslavers, and colonizers invented whiteness as a tool to facilitate the oppression of the world's inhabitants. From the very beginning, whiteness has justified the exploitation and abuse of people who do not possess white skin and straight hair, and has proceeded to indoctrinate and dominate the world with its inbred European culture, ideology, psychology, science, technology, economy, and politics. Whiteness cannot exist or survive alone because it is entirely dependent upon a black versus white binary system that defines itself by what black is not or cannot be. Accordingly, whiteness defines white and black, right and wrong, beautiful and ugly, wise and ignorant, civilized and primitive, and strong and weak. Whiteness bends facts and truth to the whims of white people and traps us in a warped reality of their making. It is a socially constructed facade that white people have overlaid or plastered upon the world. Whiteness is a racialized lens that distorts our reality by perverting our thoughts, our perceptions, and our beliefs. A lens that elevates and legitimizes white people as the superior, universal, and standard norm while stigmatizing, fetishizing, rejecting, and disparaging black people as the inferior and other. Whiteness is a combined European and European American ideology that compels the world's inhabitants to measure the value of supposedly non-white individuals by assessing how closely they each meet the socially constructed ideal or criteria of whiteness, a standard that white people have brainwashed us to believe is supreme. Whiteness teaches us to see white people as something to aspire to or mimic. Whiteness conditions us to desire white institutions, white culture, white neighborhoods, white women, white wealth, white education, white luxury goods, white hair, white skin tone, white religion, white political parties, and white economic systems. Whiteness is and will forever be a socially constructed tool used to facilitate the psychopathic expropriation and theft of natural, intellectual, environmental, and human resources from non-white people around the world. Whiteness is fluid and has evolved over the past 500 years to serve the needs and wants of those who profit the most from its proliferation. Starting in the 15th century, European imperialists began financing, subsidizing, and advancing European ethnics around the globe by enslaving, murdering, and stealing from the non-white peoples of Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Australia. Practically all of today's white wealth derives from, or is in some manner linked to, this 500-year legacy of white depravity. Accordingly, all present-day white people continue to nourish and advance themselves to various degrees by 1. Simply living off the interest, profits, returns, and dividends of the blood-stained stolen wealth that they inherited from their white ancestors, and or 2. Directly continuing the barbaric traditions of their white ancestors in some form or fashion through, for example, predatory lending, employment discrimination, banking and investment policy, colorblind institutions, corporatocracy, corporate welfare, government subsidies, the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration, the military industrial complex, the war on drugs, military invasion, coups, social welfare policy, police misconduct, housing discrimination, gun laws, white supremacist violence, torture, terrorism, international trade policy, educational inequality, tax policy, economic imperialism, globalization, and neocolonialism. Therefore, the primary directive of whiteness has remained unchanged since its inception. Whiteness was created to help hoard and concentrate the world's resources into the hands of white people, especially white elites. Please note that whiteness remains the white elite's most powerful and effective tool to maintain the oppression and exploitation of poor, struggling, underemployed white people as well, but that is an issue that will be further explored in a future video. Whiteness spawned the primary structures and institutions of the so-called modern civilized Western world. Thus, the most powerful structures and institutions of the past 500 years are designed to distribute power, privilege, resources, wealth, and innumerable other advantages to white people. In other words, whiteness is a 500-year-old, permanently hardwired and structurally institutionalized form of psychopathic affirmative action for all white people. Consequently, it should be painfully obvious why so many white racists abhor, vehemently protest, and seek to censor critical race theory. Critical race theory and other similar theories, concepts, and models unveil the corruption of whiteness and its concomitant claims of white superiority. These theories teach how whiteness created our country's institutions and how whiteness remains entrenched and continues to perpetuate white supremacy within virtually all of our nation's institutions, even those supposedly colorblind institutions like the Supreme Court. Consequently, such knowledge annihilates white racist notions of social Darwinism. Critical race theory reveals that white races have not dominated the world for the past 150 years because they are the fittest, but because they are the most depraved, degenerate, and violent. Whiteness is inextricably linked with violence. Whiteness was birthed in violence, that is, from Europe's desperate, insatiable, and lustful need to exploit the resources of foreign nations in order to avert European self-cannibalization and to ultimately enrich itself at the expense of the rest of the world. Whiteness would not exist but for the unmatched propensity of white imperialists to wield violence in furtherance of white supremacy. Whiteness justifies the commission of violent acts upon all those who are not white. Whiteness reinforces itself and ensures its survival and proliferation with violence in all of its forms, which include terroristic, physical, medical, military, sexual, environmental, economic, and cultural violence. It is chiefly this propensity to commit violent acts against humanity that enable white people to become so powerful. All people who consider themselves to be white, not just white races, are guilty of perpetuating the world's manufactured white versus black binary system because they all accept, promote, approve, and believe in the notion of a fabricated white race. This belief maintains the stratification of humanity along false, artificial racial lines. Therefore, all individuals who identify themselves as members of the white race are guilty of furthering the chief mission of whiteness, which is the promotion of white supremacy. Despite all absurd claims to the contrary, the indefensible entitlements and advantages that whiteness assigns to so-called white people are not invisible to white people. They lie in plain sight. Thus, even the most abjectly impoverished, degenerate, and subjugated white races are aware of the myriad number of unearned and undeserved privileges set aside for white people. For the white races, the particular social and psychological value of whiteness is indispensable to his or her ego. Such awareness is displayed each and every time white racists, no matter how savage or debased they may be, proclaim to themselves, to each other, and to the world that they are still, and if ever will be, better than niggers. Accordingly, white racists are addicted to their fantasy of whiteness because it allows them to escape the horror, vileness, and evil of their being. For many white people, and certainly all white races, the loss of their identity as white will be cataclysmic because whiteness informs their truth, reality, and very sense of self. White racists will believe what they must or need to believe in order to maintain the delusion of their white superiority. Consequently, white racists will defend this racial delusion at all costs. White racists become distressed when they perceive any potential threat to the preeminent position of whiteness, which includes any possible threat to their 1. Stolen economic base, 2. Overwhelming military dominance, or 3. Fragile binary worldview. Their fierce protection of whiteness explains much of their seemingly irrational and outrageous behavior. Prime examples include the idolization of Donald Trump and the January 6th Capitol insurrection. White racists denounce affirmative action, any mention of reparations, and any other policy designed to compensate our people for the immeasurable resources and wealth stolen from our ancestors by white oppressors. Why? Because the enactment of any such programs represents a direct threat to white power and an acknowledgement that white racists have dominated the world not because of their claimed racial superiority, but because of their unmatched greed, rapacity, and moral turpitude. So, to summarize our exploration of Step 2 of Omonera, we have identified the oppressor's adoption of their binary part, and we have answered the question, how is whiteness central to white racist identity? More specifically, we have discovered that 1. Whiteness is a racialized lens that distorts our reality by perverting our thoughts, our perceptions, and our beliefs. A lens that elevates and legitimizes white people as a superior, universal, and standard norm, while stigmatizing, fetishizing, rejecting, and disparaging black people as the inferior and other. 2. Whiteness festers in the minds of those who believe that the white race is a biological reality instead of a socially constructed political and economic reality, whose existence depends upon the continuous oppression, domination, and exploitation of all non-white peoples. 3. The primary directive of whiteness has remained unchanged since its inception: to help hoard and concentrate the world's resources into the hands of white people, especially white elites. 4. Whiteness is a combined European and European American ideology that compels the world's inhabitants to measure the value of supposedly non-white individuals by assessing how closely they each meet the socially constructed ideal or criteria of whiteness, the standard that white people have brainwashed us to believe is supreme. 5. Whiteness reinforces itself and ensures its survival and proliferation with violence in all of its forms, which include terroristic, physical, medical, military, sexual, environmental, economic, and cultural violence. And it is chiefly this propensity to commit violent acts against humanity that enabled white people to become so powerful. And 6. Whiteness is a 500-year-old, permanently hardwired and structurally institutionalized form of psychopathic affirmative action for all white people. This concludes our exploration of Step 2 of Omonera's 5 steps. Stay tuned for our next episode, which will explore Step 3 of Omonera, identifying how white racist psychopathy enables the oppression of our people. In this upcoming video, we will answer the question, what lies beneath white racism? Please subscribe to our Unenslaved channel for all upcoming videos. Thank you.